The morning of Lady Ashworth's autumn gathering. A woman stood at the edge of the drawing room in a gown the color of winter fog, and the room did not see her. That was not quite true. The room saw the veil. It was plain muslin, unadorned, the kind a woman in modest circumstances might retain from mourning when she could afford nothing more suitable to the occasion, and it sat over dark hair, dressed simply at the nape of her neck, in a manner that suggested neither artifice nor carelessness, but rather a person who had more pressing concerns than ornament. The room noticed the veil the way it noticed a chair, placed wrongly, or a window left unlatched. It catalogued the veil as a fact about this woman, and from the fact it drew its conclusions, and from its conclusions it arranged its face. She was Mrs. Cecily Holt, 2 years a widow, 26 years old, and in possession of a small house in Wiltshire that she had managed alone since her husband's death, because there was no one else to manage it. She had been invited to Ashworth Park because her late husband had been a cousin of Lady Ashworth's third greatest friend, a connection so attenuated it barely warranted the word, and she had accepted the invitation because her nearest neighbor, old Mrs. Farrow, had insisted she could not spend another autumn in that house reading improving books to no one. So she had come. She stood now in a room full of silk and feathers, and the small, bright noise of people who knew exactly where they belonged, and she held a cup of tea she had not yet managed to drink, and she did not know what had possessed her to come. She did not see the Baron of Caldervane until he was already in the room. He entered from the terrace, where he had apparently been standing in the November cold without a greatcoat, and the doors admitted him in a brief rush of grey air that made 3 candles gutter on the mantelpiece. He was tall, with a quality of stillness that seemed to organize itself around him even in motion, so that the room shifted subtly when he crossed it, the way a river shifts around a stone. His hair was dark and cut close, his jaw clean-shaved, and set with a slight tension that was not anger, precisely, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has decided what he thinks of a situation before the situation has finished presenting itself. He wore a fitted dark coat without decoration, and he moved to the far end of the room and stood with his back very nearly to a window, which meant he was watching the gathering without quite being in it. He did not look at Cecily. She had not expected him to. If you have ever waited for something you told yourself you did not want, you will understand the next hour of Cecily's morning. She moved through Lady Ashworth's drawing room with the careful economy of a woman who has learned not to ask for what she does not expect to receive. She spoke when spoken to. She did not press herself forward. She listened with genuine attention to a discussion of wool prices that she actually understood, having managed a small flock herself, and she offered one precise observation that produced a brief pause from her interlocutor, a red-faced gentleman named Mr. Foote, who looked at her as though reconsidering something, then returned to speaking as though she had not. This was the texture of the life she had been living for 2 years. Lady Honoria Drummond noticed Cecily's veil at 11 o'clock, which was to say she had been aware of it since Cecily's arrival, and had only now decided to make use of it. Lady Honoria was a handsome woman in her middle 40s, a baronet's wife, whose position in the county rested on the twin pillars of her husband's moderate income and her own unflinching certainty that she knew the proper order of things. She crossed the room to Lady Ashworth's side, touched her arm lightly, and said, in a carrying voice, calibrated to be heard precisely as far as it needed to be heard, "Is that the widow Holt? Poor creature! She hasn't anything else to wear." Cecily heard it. She had been standing 3 feet away behind the screen of a conversation about the road from Taunton. She heard it with the particular quality of attention a person reserves for things she expected and has nonetheless hoped would not arrive. She did not look up. She turned her cup of tea in her hands and fixed her attention on a brass candlestick on the sideboard until the sensation in her throat subsided. The Baron of Caldervane was across the room. She had not been watching him, but she was aware, in the way that one is aware of a shift in the weather without looking at the sky, that his eyes had moved. Lord Nathaniel Ashby, Baron of Caldervane, had come to Lady Ashworth's gathering for reasons he had not examined closely. He had been in the county for 3 weeks, staying at the estate he had inherited from his older brother, 2 years prior, and, the estate still did not feel like his. He had told himself for 3 weeks that coming into any society would be an imposition. What he had not told himself, because telling oneself a true thing and acting upon it are different operations. He had not planned to stay at the gathering past noon. He stood at his window end of the room, where he could observe without being easily drawn into the orbit of conversation, and he had been observing Mrs. Sanday Holt for 40 minutes without quite intending to. She was not the most striking woman in the room. He was clear-eyed enough to know this. She had a face that repaid attention, dark eyes with a steadiness in them that he had noticed from across the drawing room and could not account for by distance, and the posture of someone who has decided that what she cannot change, she will not permit to diminish her. She was in gray. The veil was plain. He did not look at the veil with anything other than the recognition that it was a veil, and that it meant something about what this woman had lost, and that neither the veil nor the loss was any occasion for comment. When Lady Honoria's voice carried its small, precise cruelty across the room, he saw Mrs. Holt's hands tighten on her cup. He did not move. Not then. He filed the moment in a private register and turned his attention to a discussion about drainage on the North Road, which was the kind of discussion he could navigate without being present in it. The gathering moved to luncheon, and Cecily found herself seated at the far end of the table, between the red-faced Mr. Foote and an elderly gentleman named Colonel Penhaligon, who was kind and nearly deaf, and therefore excellent company. The table was set for 22, with the particular abundance of a household that entertains in order to demonstrate its abundance rather than for any natural pleasure in company. And the food was good even if the conversation at Cecily's end of it was not. She ate with appetite, because she had learned in the past 2 years that one eats when food is offered, and she listened to Colonel Penhaligon describe the flood of 1812 with a courtesy she did not have to perform. Lord Caldervane was seated near the table's center, at Lady Ashworth's left hand. Cecily did not look at him. She was aware, with that peripheral quality of attention she seemed unable to suppress in his vicinity, that he spoke little and listened with a quality of patience that was not boredom, but something more considered. A man holding his own counsel. After luncheon, the company dispersed across the house. Some went to the gallery, some went to sit in the second drawing room, where a fire was lit and the rugs were thick. Cecily, who had no particular destination, found her way to the library, which was where she had most wanted to be since arriving. She was examining a shelf of natural philosophy texts, her finger tracing the spine of a volume on mineral formations in the southwest counties, when she heard a step in the doorway. She turned. Lord Caldervane stood in the entrance of the library, with the air of a man who has come to this room deliberately, and is not surprised to find it occupied. "Mrs. Holt," he said. It was the first time he had spoken to her. His voice was low and level, the kind of voice that does not raise itself to make its point. "My lord," she said. A pause settled between them unhurried. He crossed the threshold and came to stand at the near end of the shelves, which meant they were separated by perhaps 8 feet of Persian carpet and a great deal of the particular awareness that inhabits rooms where 2 people have not yet decided what they are to each other. "You know this collection," he said. It was not a question. "I know this volume," she said, and held up the mineral formations text. "My husband had a copy. There is an error in the index. Under basalt. The author has transposed 2 entries. Something in his expression adjusted. Not warmth. Exactly, not yet. But a recalibration, the way a very precise instrument responds to a new measurement." "Show me," he said. She opened the volume to the index, and found the error, and he came to stand beside her to look at it, close enough that she was aware of the cold that had followed him in from the terrace, still faintly present in his coat. He studied the transposed entries with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and the silence in the library had a different texture than the silence in the drawing room. "You were a naturalist," he said when he looked up. "My husband was. I was his correspondence corrector and his field notes copyist for 6 years. She paused, then said, because she had nothing to lose by honesty, "I learned rather a great deal." He looked at her steadily. She did not look away. "There is a collection of survey maps in the Eastern Cabinet," he said at last. "If you wish to see them." She wished to see them. They spent 40 minutes in the library that afternoon, moving quietly between shelves, while the rest of Lady Ashworth's gathering occupied itself in the other rooms, and she told him which of the survey maps corresponded to formations she had read about in her husband's field notes. And he listened with the attention of a person who is genuinely interested in the thing being said, not the person saying it. This, she thought with a careful internal composure, meant nothing. Men listened to useful things. It had nothing to do with her. She did not quite believe it. She did not quite believe it. When the gathering reassembled for tea, Cecily came back into the first drawing room to find Lady Honoria Drummond stationed near the fireplace with a small audience of 3. And she knew from the configuration of their bodies the slight forward lean and the suppressed amusement of those listening that she had been under discussion. Lady Honoria looked at her as she entered, said something too low to carry across the room that produced a laugh from the woman on her left, and then arranged her face into an expression of polished welcome. "Mrs. Holt, have you been wandering the house? You must find it rather overwhelming after Wiltshire." Cecily smiled with her mouth. "I was in the library," she said. "It is a fine collection." "Yes," said Lady Honoria. "I suppose books are a comfort." The inference was as clear as it was carefully deniable. Books were what one had when one had nothing else. Cecily set down her cup, thanked her hostess, and went to find Colonel Penhaligon, who wanted to tell her about the flood of 1812 from the beginning, and whom she preferred to anyone else in the room. She did not look for Lord Caldervane. He had returned to his window end of the room, and she could feel without looking the particular quality of his stillness. It was a stillness that had been, she thought, directed at Lady Honoria's corner of the room just for a moment, though when she allowed herself a glance in his direction, he was gazing at the middle distance with the impartial expression of a man thinking of something else entirely. She was not at all sure he was thinking of something else. 2 days passed in the ordinary manner of a country gathering. Cecily walked the grounds with Colonel Penhaligon in the mornings, sat with the ladies in the afternoons, and spent the evenings in the first drawing-room where Lady Ashworth's guests occupied themselves with cards and conversation in the proportion that their natures required. She saw Lord Caldervane at every meal, and once in the morning when she came down early and found him in the hallway with his coat and his hat, returning from a ride that had apparently begun before daylight. He had looked at her with a direct attention she was beginning to recognize as simply the manner of a man who does not bother with the social performance of not looking. "You are up early," he said. "I am generally up early," she said. "The sheep do not keep hours." Something shifted in his expression, briefly, in the direction of what might almost have been a smile. Then it settled again into its habitual gravity, and he told her that the east path to the garden was dry if she wished to walk it, and went upstairs. She walked the east path and thought about the particular intelligence of a face that almost smiled. On the 3rd day she found herself witness to something she had not expected. Lady Ashworth's youngest child, a girl of perhaps 7 named Harriet, had followed a cat into the long gallery and become distressed when the animal took refuge on a high ledge behind a marble bust, entirely out of reach. Harriet was not crying, precisely, but she was producing the controlled sounds of a child who has decided that crying is beneath her and is finding this decision difficult to maintain. Cecily found her there on her way to the portrait room, assessed the situation, brought over a side chair, climbed it without ceremony, and retrieved the cat from behind the bust. The marble was cold and the cat was resistant, and she had to hook her arm around it and pull firmly while the cat expressed its opinion of this with great clarity, and Harriet watched the whole operation with the solemn attention of a person witnessing a feat of engineering. "There!" said Cecily, when the cat was subdued and returned to the child's arms. She stepped down from the chair and smoothed her skirt. "Thank you," said Harriet with grave precision. "He did not want to be rescued," Cecily said, but he will forgive you by evening." Harriet considered this. "Will he forgive you?" "He will have forgotten me entirely," Cecily said. "That is the advantage of cats." She did not know that Lord Caldervane had been standing at the far end of the gallery for the last 3 minutes. He had come to look at the landscape paintings that ran along the north wall, had heard Harriet's distress, and had rounded the corner to find Mrs. Holt already on the chair. He had stayed where he was. He had watched her work the cat free from behind the marble, with a practical competence that had nothing of performance in it. Watched her speak to the child with the directness of a person who does not speak to children differently than to adults. And watched her step down and smooth her skirt and continue the conversation, as though she had done nothing of particular note. He had been looking for one good reason to stop thinking about her. He had not found it. He returned to the landscape paintings and spent a longer time than usual in consideration of a medium-sized view of a Wiltshire vale that suddenly seemed to him very interesting. On the 4th evening, Lady Ashworth organized a small program of music and recitation for her guests. The furniture in the first drawing room was rearranged to accommodate the gathering, which meant the accustomed social geography was disrupted, and people settled in new configurations. Cecily found a chair at the near end of the room, close to the window, which was where the less fashionable guests tended to accumulate, which suited her. The entertainment was modest and pleasant, and she listened with the attention she brought to most things which was genuine. Lord Caldervane did not sit. He stood, as was apparently his custom, near the back of the arrangement, one shoulder against the wall in the posture of a man who intends to leave at any moment and has not yet left. He did not leave. She was aware of him in the way she had become accustomed to being aware of him. Without looking, without acknowledging to herself precisely what the awareness meant. She watched Miss Trentham perform admirably on the pianoforte, and told herself that she had 4 more days of this gathering, and then she would return to Wiltshire and the sheep and the improving books, and Lord Caldervane would recede to the category of a person she had met once at a gathering, which was the appropriate category. What Cecily had not yet permitted herself to understand was that the wound she carried from 2 years of managing alone was not grief, exactly, though she had grieved. It was the accumulated weight of being told, by the machinery of her circumstances, that she did not occupy enough space in the world to be worth attending to. Her husband had been kind and genuinely fond of her, and his death had left her not only alone, but somehow smaller, as though the loss had contracted the territory in which she was permitted to exist. The veil was not mourning, not any more. It was armor of the only variety available to a woman with £200 a year and a small house in Wiltshire. She had been wearing armor so long, she had nearly forgotten what she was protecting. The next morning brought the event that Cecily had been distantly dreading since she arrived, which was that Lady Ashworth announced a card party for the following evening, the largest entertainment of the week, to which she had invited the county's broader acquaintance. This meant, as Cecily understood the arithmetic of social gatherings without having to be told, that the room would contain not only the people already assembled, but their opinions in their most concentrated form, and the opinions of Lady Honoria at a card party, amplified by her broader audience, were not something Cecily had any means to survive. With dignity intact, she considered for one honest moment pleading a headache. She did not plead it. She had done nothing wrong, and she had not traveled from Wiltshire to retreat before a woman who had never once been forced to manage anything alone. The card party assembled at 7 in the evening, and the rooms were lit with more candles than Cecily had seen in a private house since her husband's last autumn. There were 60 people at least, and the noise was the particular noise of a gathering that believes itself to be enjoying itself, composed of equal parts genuine pleasure and performed abundance. Cecily wore the gray gown again, because it was what she had, and she held herself with the composure of a woman who has decided that she will not pretend to be something she is not. Lady Honoria found her within the first quarter hour. "Mrs. Holt," the greeting had the quality of a verdict, "I had wondered whether you would attend. I imagine these evenings are rather different from what you are accustomed to." A woman beside her, Mrs. Briefer, Cavendish, one of the county's more attentive gossips, turned to look at Cecily with the particular quality of attention that precedes a story. "I find them pleasant," Cecily said. "Yes, I am sure," said Lady Honoria. "Though I confess I would have thought, in your circumstances, you might find the expense of the journey scarcely worth the return." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "The poor widow of Maplethwaite, all this way, in that veil." Mrs. Cavendish looked at the veil. She looked, and Cecily watched her look, and felt the familiar cold dissent of a verdict being formed, the season making up its mind. She was spared having to respond by the arrival of Colonel Penhaligon, who was in excellent spirits, and wished to show her a new trick with playing cards that he had been practicing since luncheon. She excused herself with a grace she did not entirely feel, and went with the Colonel, and she did not look back at Lady Honoria's face. It was 9:30, and the card party was at its highest pitch, when Cecily overheard Mrs. Preet. Cavendish speaking to another woman near the doorway of the second room. "Lady Honoria says she came without anything suitable to wear." A widow from the country, quite without resources, apparently angling for the Caldervane interest, now that she has contrived to spend time in his vicinity. I would not have credited it, except that Lady Honoria has known the family for years. Cecily stood very still behind the doorframe for 3 full seconds. Then she continued into the room, because there was nothing else to do. She did not cry. She had not cried since the week of her husband's funeral, and she had no intention of beginning now in Lady Ashworth's card room. She found a chair at an uncontested card table where a game of commerce had recently concluded, and she sat in it, and she arranged her face and her hands with the deliberate competence of a woman who has learned to sit quietly inside her own dignity when the world makes its arrangements around her. She did not see Lord Caldervane cross the room toward her. She felt it. The same displacement of social atmosphere that accompanied his entrances, the subtle reorganization of the air in his vicinity reached her before she saw him. And she looked up, and he was standing at the table across from her with an expression she could not read, though she had been studying his face for 4 days. He sat down. He said, his voice very low, "I was told you wished to speak with me about the Wiltshire survey maps." She blinked. "I said nothing of the sort." "No," he said, "I know." He held her gaze across the table. "Are you well, Mrs. Holt?" The question was so direct and so quiet that she felt it in her sternum, a small, precise impact. "I am tolerably well," she said. "Tolerably," he repeated. She looked at the table's surface. A scattering of cards from the concluded game, a candlestick, a pair of gloves someone had left. "Lady Honoria has been generous with her views," she said. "I understand I am angling for your interest." A pause. "Then, are you?" "Standrist." "Wall." Her eyes came up to his. Something in the question was different from what she had expected. Some quality in the level voice that was not amusement and was not nothing. "I am attempting to play commerce without being subjected to further observation," she said. "That is the entire extent of my evening's ambition." Something moved in his face. It was brief and carefully contained, and it might, in a brighter light, have been described as the first declension of his composure. "Then I will not impose," he said. He did not move. "Walk with me," he said instead, and it was the quiet command she had heard from him before, the one the room would read as coldness, and she had begun to read as something quite different. She stood. He walked beside her to the windows at the far end of the first drawing room, where the curtains were pulled back to show the dark November grounds, and the noise of the gathering receded behind them. "Caldervane," she said carefully, because she had not yet permitted herself his title as an address. "The maps," he said, as if he had begun a sentence some time ago and was continuing it, "interested you because of the basin formations near Frome." She stared at him. "You said so. In the library," he said. "You said your husband had corresponded with the surveyor about subsurface limestone. I should like to hear more about it, if you are willing." This was not what she had expected him to say. She had not known what she expected, but it was not this. "That is a very specific topic for a card party," she said. "I find card parties improved by specific topics," he said. She told them about the limestone survey. He listened as he always did, with the complete attention of a person who is not managing the conversation but genuinely in it. And the noise of Lady Ashworth's 60 guests receded further, and the November night pressed its cold against the glass, and Cecily felt something she had not felt in 2 years, which was the particular warmth of being interesting to a person who had not decided in advance what she was. She stopped herself. She stopped the warmth and returned it to the safe cold register, where she kept the things she did not permit herself. "Lord Caldervane," she said carefully, "I am aware that Lady Honoria's observations require some form of management, and that it may be expedient to be seen speaking with me this evening." He looked at her. The look was very still and very direct. "I am speaking with you," he said, "because I have wanted to since the first day, and I have been finding reasons not to, and I have run out of reasons." The room was behind them. The room had not stopped. It continued its 60-person noise and its card tables and its candlelight, and Cecily stood at the window of Ashworth Park and felt the warmth return, despite everything she had told herself. "That is a frank admission," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the dark grounds. A wind moved through the trees at the edge of the estate, invisible but audible through the glass. And she thought of her house in Wiltshire, which was small and quiet, and entirely hers. And she thought of 2 years of managing alone. And she thought of the particular damage that is done not by great cruelty, but by the accumulated weight of being made to feel small. "I do not know what you intend," she said at last. "I intend," he said, with the quietness of a man who has decided something and is now simply saying it, "to call on you in Wiltshire, if you will permit it. I intend to continue the conversation about the limestone survey. I intend, if it suits you, to find out whether what I suspect about you is accurate." Her throat felt very tight. "And what do you suspect?" "That you are worth considerably more than this room has managed to determine," he said. She did not look away from him. She also did not trust herself to speak. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time. She drew a breath. Her hands at her sides were perfectly still, and it cost her something to keep them so. "You should know," she said, "that I have £200 a year, and a house in Wiltshire that needs new roof tiles and a flock of sheep that has opinions about everything." "I know," he said. Mrs. Farrow mentioned the sheep. She stared at him. "You spoke to Mrs. Farrow? She was at the Penheligon dinner in October," he said, without apparent embarrassment. "She told me about her neighbor in Wiltshire at some length. She mentioned the improving books." Cecily thought of old Mrs. Farrow with a rush of affection so sudden it nearly undid her composure entirely. "She did not tell me." "She would not," he said. "She is a woman of considerable strategy." The warmth that Cecily had been refusing for 4 days finally broke through the careful architecture she had built against it, and it was not triumphant or loud, but simply present, real, the way good things are when they finally arrive. She looked at him, at his grave face, and his dark eyes, and the quality of stillness in him that had nothing of coldness in it, and she understood, properly understood, that it had never been coldness. She said, "You may call—" What she did not say, because she did not yet have to say it, was that she had been waiting to be seen like this for a very long time, and that the seeing of it had arrived, not with fanfare but with a word, her given name spoken without ceremony by a man who had quietly run out of reasons not to say it. The moment was private, and it was complete, and she was not yet prepared for what happened when they turned back toward the room. Lady Honoria saw them first. She had been watching, as people with vested positions always watch, and she had seen them at the window, and she had seen the quality of Lord Caldervane's attention and the composition of Mrs. Holt's face, and she had seen something she had not expected, which produced in her expression the brief involuntary calculation of a woman reassessing a verdict she has declared ad volume. She came across the room. She brought Mrs. Tatt. Cavendish with her, which was a miscalculation of the specific kind that confident people make when they have not yet understood that their confidence has outpaced their intelligence. "Lord Caldervane," she said with the particular warmth of a woman who has just rearranged her position on an axis she did not know was moving. "I had wondered where you had gone." He looked at Lady Honoria with an expression that contained nothing and communicated everything. His gaze moved from her face to the space behind her, where Mrs. Cavendish stood, and then back. "I have been in conversation with Mrs. Brack." "Halt," he said. "Yes," said Lady Honoria with the brightness of a woman who is realigning. "She is such a dear creature. One does feel for her circumstances." The room had begun to attend. Not all of it, but enough of it. Cavendish had brought her attention from behind Lady Honoria, and Colonel Penhaligon had turned from his adjacent card table, and Lady Ashworth herself had paused in conversation with someone near the fire. Lord Caldervane stepped forward, a single, deliberate step, and he offered his arm to Cecily. She took it. Her gloved hand rested on his sleeve, and she felt the steadiness of him through the fabric, the quality of intention in the gesture, and she kept her face composed and her spine level, and she did not look at Lady Honoria's expression shift. He spoke into the gathered attention of the room without raising his voice. "Mrs. Holt has done me the honor of permitting my call in Wiltshire," he said. "I am grateful for it." The room received this. The room absorbed it and rearranged itself around it with the speed of a company of people who understand, instantly and completely, what has just occurred, and what it will mean for every conversation they will have about this evening for the rest of the winter. Lady Honoria's fan was held, for a moment, at the wrong angle. She recovered. She was a woman of long social experience, and she recovered, said something gracious about Wiltshire being charming in the winter months, and removed herself from the vicinity with the particular grace of a person who has decided to accept a correction and is doing it well enough that most of the room will miss that it occurred. Most of the room missed it. Mrs. Cavendish did not. Cecily stood at Lord Caldervane's side with her hand on his sleeve, and felt the evening reorganize itself around her, and she thought, this is what it is to be seen. Not acclaimed, not celebrated, not vindicated by trumpet and fanfare. Seen by a person whose seeing reorders the room simply by being accurate. She did not gloat. She would not have known how. Colonel Penhaligon appeared at her elbow and said, with the cheerful certainty of a man who considers this matter entirely settled, "Excellent. Now, Mrs. Holt, I shall beat you at commerce." She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it surprised her a little. The ease of it. Lord Caldervane's arm was still under her hand. He looked at her with the look that was not warmth yet, but was everything adjacent to it, and she let herself see it without translating it into something smaller. He said very quietly, "Commerce. I warn you," she said. "I play very well." "Yes," he said. "I had suspected as much." December came to Wiltshire before Cecily returned to it, and by the time she crossed her own threshold, the hedgerows were white with the first frost, and the sheep were loud about it in the manner of creatures who hold strong views on temperature. She stood in her own parlor, with her valise still in hand, and looked at the room she had been managing alone for 2 years. The shelves of her husband's natural philosophy texts, the desk where she had copied his field notes, the small fire, Mrs. Quo. Pharaoh had sent her girl to lay before Cecily's arrival, and she felt the particular quality of a person who has returned to a familiar place with something different about herself. On the mantelpiece, between a geological specimen from the Mendip Hills and a small clock that kept approximate time, sat a letter. She set down the valise and opened it. It was from Lord Caldervane. It was 3 sentences, written in the direct, unornamented hand she might have predicted. He would call on Friday, if convenient. He wished to examine the Mendip survey notes she had mentioned. He remained, faithfully, hers. Faithfully. She sat down in the chair by the fire and held the letter in her lap and let herself, for the first time in 2 years, believe in the small, warm word at the close of it. Outside, the frost thickened on the glass. The sheep complained steadily in the field behind the house. The geological specimen on the mantelpiece, rose-colored limestone from a field survey she had conducted with her husband in the summer of their second year, caught the firelight and held it. She had been in this room hundreds of times since his death, and it had been her room and her shelter and her territory, and it had never before felt like the beginning of something. She read the 3 sentences again. If this story has stayed with you, if you have known what it is to stand in a bright room and feel invisible, you understand why Friday mattered. She set the letter on the mantelpiece beside the limestone, and she looked at it there, next to the specimen of a world that had been waiting quietly to be seen, and she allowed herself the warmth of it. The sheep characteristically disapproved of his horse. He found this neither alarming nor inconvenient. She showed him the survey notes and the Mendip correspondence and the index error in the mineral formations volume that she had found in the Ashworth Library. He stayed longer than was perhaps strictly indicated by the survey notes. They spoke about limestone and about Wiltshire winters and about Mrs. Farrow, who had apparently sent him a recipe for the preservation of fruit as a gesture of goodwill that he found both surprising and somewhat pointed. He accepted a cup of tea. He accepted a second cup. At the end of the afternoon, standing in her doorway with the cold coming in behind him and his hat in his hand, he looked at her with the direct attention that she had now decided she would stop trying to translate into something smaller than what it was. He said, "Next Friday, she said. She watched him ride down the lane through the winter bare hedgerows until the gray afternoon folded him away. She went inside. She closed the door. The fire in the parlor was still warm, and the limestone on the mantelpiece still held its rose color in the light, and the letter was where she had left it. She did not move the letter for the rest of the winter. He had called 6 times before he told her about his brother. It was a Tuesday in late January, and the light on the Wiltshire fields was the thin, bright light of a winter that has not yet decided to ease. They had walked the south pasture because Cecily wished to show him the limestone outcrop that corresponded to the survey notation he had found most interesting in his brother's papers. His brother had been a student of natural history. She had not known this. He had mentioned it so briefly in the library at Ashworth Park in reference to the survey maps that she had not registered the weight of it, and it was only when he said, "On the path through the pasture with the frost still visible in the low places, Edward had marked these formations too," that she understood. He said it without looking at her. His eyes were on the outcrop which rose from the turf in a pale wedge like the prow of a ship, and she let the silence settle before she said anything. "He was older than you," she said at last. "By 8 years. A pause. He was the one who knew what to do with Caldervane. I inherited the estate, and the tenants, and his correspondence, and his survey maps, and the particular difficulty of becoming the person you were not raised to be." She looked at the limestone. She had learned in the weeks of his visits that he said the most important things in the quietest register, and that silence was not dismissal, but rather the space he left for a person to answer honestly. "When did you lose him?" she asked. 2 years ago, the autumn before last. He turned then to look at her, the same season as your husband. She had not known this either, and it settled between them with the gravity of a shared thing recognized, the way a map aligns with a landscape, and you see suddenly that you have been traveling the same territory by different roads. "You were at Caldervane for the whole of that winter," she said, "and most of the year after." He looked back at the outcrop. There were tenants to manage, and accounts to settle, and a great deal of Edward's business that had been left in the kind of order a man leaves when he expects to have more time. A breath. I was not good company. "Were you ever?" she said, and then stopped herself, because the question was more familiar than she had intended. He looked at her with the quality she had come to trust, the directness that was not unkindness. "No," he said. "I was told so repeatedly as a boy. Edward was the one who knew how to be easy in a room." He paused. "I was the one who knew which survey maps had errors in their indexes." She laughed. It was the same real laugh she had produced at the card party, and she saw the same quality of response in him, the brief declension of gravity, the face that had nearly decided to be amused. "That is not entirely a compliment," she said. I intended it as one, he said. They stood in the pasture with the sheep keeping their judgmental distance and the winter light on the limestone. And Cecily understood, with the particular clarity that comes when a thing you have been protecting yourself from has already happened, that she had stopped protecting herself from this some weeks ago without noticing the moment of it. She said, "Nathaniel." It was the first time he went very still, the way he was still when something mattered. "Cecily," he said. They stood in the frost-edged pasture, near the rose-pale limestone that both of them had come to, by separate roads of grief and isolation, and the stubborn dignity of continuing anyway, and the thing that had been accumulating between them since the library at Ashworth Park arrived now at its proper name, which was not contract, and was not convenience, and was not the management of social situations, but simply the wanting of this particular person's company in this particular world. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back to the house with the sheep watching, and the winter light, thin and clear, on everything, and neither of them said anything more that needed to be said.